Everyone, and welcome to our wellness webinar series. I'm so delighted to be joined today by Dr. Lindsay Malloy and Dr. Amanda Zelahusky. They're going to be talking to us about guilt, grief, and grace. Oh my, parenting during a pandemic. This is something that we're all wondering about, and in particular as we approach the holidays. So I'm excited to learn a little bit alongside you. So as we get going, I wanted to do a welcome and a land acknowledgement. The Strong Mind, Strong Kids head office is located on sacred land that has been a site of human activity for over 15,000 years. The land is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat, and is now home to many diverse peoples. We acknowledge that the City of Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. We acknowledge these nations and any other recorded or unrecorded First Peoples who cared for the land as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land named Takaranto, where the trees meet the water, or the gathering place. As settlers, we entered into an agreement to share this land equitably. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must also be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. We are so very grateful for the opportunity to work with communities and on this territory. So who are we? I want to introduce myself. My name is Mandy Hickman. I'm the Manager of Programs and Community Partnerships with Strong Mind, Strong Kids Psychology Canada. We've just recently changed our name. You might know us as the Psychology Foundation of Canada, but we're very excited to be introducing our new look and feel. We've got the same amazing programs and services, and our mission remains the same. It is nurturing resilience in children and youth. So as you may know, we have programs that span the age ranges from birth all the way up to adults. So we start with Make the Connection from birth to age 3, where this is a program where we support parents and caregivers in developing a secure attachment with their babies. We move on through the school years with Kids Have Stress Too and Stress Lessons. And these are programs that help to support young people with developing stress management strategies that they can take throughout their lives. And on to the elder teens and adults, where we have a program called Stress Strategies. This is an interactive tool that you can log on to and develop an action plan related to a stressor in your life. So I'd encourage you to take a look at our website. Just a little bit about our Make the Connection program. In 2020, we developed an e-learning course that is designed for childcare professionals who are working with young children. And this is all about identifying what are those solid activities that you can do with families that help to encourage a healthy, secure attachment with their young child. This is a program that comes with a facilitator guide, and it takes about an hour to go through. And I will be honest, I think it's a really beautiful product. So if you're interested, I encourage you to take a look and visit our website. Kids Have Stress Too and Stress Lessons, as I mentioned, are stress management programs that help to develop strategies and skills for young people in the classroom and beyond. These are programs that we offer training in and facilitator guides. So please take a look at our website for more information. And I recognize I've introduced myself, and I will very quickly turn it over to Dr. Malloy and Dr. Zelahusky. But first, I wanted to get a sense of who is joining us today. So can you please share in the chat, or excuse me, in this poll, who is joining us today? What capacity are you joining us? Are you a professional that works with children? Are you a parent, or perhaps you're both? And I also wanted to take an opportunity to just let you know that we will be taking questions. We're recording the program, and so we will be sending this out to everybody afterwards, but we're definitely here to answer your questions. So please queue them up in the Q&A rather than the chat, and that'll help us to organize it a little bit more succinctly. And just gonna close our polling for now and share. So we've got, for the most part, 46% have said that they're both parents and professionals. So thanks so much for joining us today. And one more poll as we get going. I'm really excited as well that we had 491 people who'd registered with us today, which is a huge number. So let me just stop sharing on that one, and let us know where you're joining us from. So in what part of the country are joining us? And if you're not, if you don't see yourself here, perhaps you're joining us from the US or Europe or elsewhere, please share in the chat, as we'd love to hear from you. And I'll end this poll. Thanks, everybody. And it looks like we've got, for the most part, people who are joining us from Ontario and Quebec. And we've got some folks from the Atlantic region, Prairie, and the West Coast. So thanks again for joining us. Oh, now I will introduce our amazing presenters. So I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Amanda Zelahusky. She's a licensed clinical and forensic psychologist and attorney specializing in trauma. She's a board certified in clinical child and adolescent psychology and has worked clinically with adults, children, and families. As an associate professor of psychology at Valparaiso University, she directs the Psychology, Law, and Trauma Lab, where she conducts research on the impact of childhood trauma. In addition, Dr. Zelahusky provides training and consultation to numerous mental health, legal, educational, and child welfare agencies. And more importantly, she is a wife and mom of 3 young children, mostly just trying to make sure her kids have clothes on when they bust into our virtual meetings. We're so happy to have you here. And I want to introduce you to Dr. Lindsay Malloy, who's an associate professor of psychology at Ontario Tech University, specializing in developmental and forensic psychology. She's the director of the Development, Context, and Communication Lab, and her research addresses how, why, and to whom children and teens disclose negative or traumatic experiences, as well as factors that influence children's memory, deception, and narratives. She frequently provides expert testimony and consultation related to children's communication about and memory of difficult events. Dr. Malloy is also a wife and mother of 2 young children, trying to navigate all of the COVID-19 uncertainty with a little help from chocolate and Disney Plus. So I'll turn it on over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm just going to close out of this poll. Thanks, Mandy, for the introduction. And we're excited to be here. I'm excited to work with this great organization. I'm going to share my screen. Let's hope I can get this to work. Ta-da, did that work? Okay, great. So thank you so much, Mandy, and everyone for being here. We're really excited to talk with you today about guilt, grief, and grace, parenting during a pandemic. So, and first, starting off just thinking about what pandemic parenting has looked like for you. Most of you in the chat indicated that you were a parent, or maybe a parent and a mental health professional. And so we just have some pictures here to highlight what it has looked like for, well, this was pre-pandemic, but I think it got us all set up pretty nicely for what was coming in our future that we didn't realize maybe. I love this picture too, which a mom posted doing an interview, and if you can see that everything looks very professional and nice, but of course, you know, the real story is evident when you kind of pan away. And I was, you know, telling Mandy before we started this that I have to make sure my laptop's at the exact perfect angle, because even 3 inches to the side and you would see the state of my house currently. And, you know, this pandemic has brought a lot of, well, there's just no separation between work life and home life, and the interruptions, the constant negotiations about what each person has that day. And that's, of course, if you're lucky enough to be parenting with a partner. And we just did a webinar on single parents and co-parenting and what that looks like, and the added stressors there. So we definitely fully recognize that there's a lot of layers at privilege here at work in determining what this pandemic parenting has looked like for people. I think Amanda What would you have to
Yeah.
say about it?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Yeah. Thanks for having us. Thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, this was actually an example in real life just a few weeks ago of my little 4-year-old who is wearing clothes. In fact, he is dressed as Batman in this particular instance. And I was teaching an evening class in my professor life, and he just Batman burst right into the class live. And so I think as working parents, we have a lot of these stories, exactly as you said, Lindsay, of really not having that work-life separation or family and work-life balance there. And so, yeah, so pandemic parenting has looked very different for all of us in some of these different examples.
Definitely. And so a good sort of metaphor for it is, you might have seen, is that showing up, Amanda? Oh, it's not showing up on my, okay. So anyway, so that, we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. So we've seen a lot of that imagery and kind of discussion and the media that, well, we're all in the same storm. And that's true. But some of us are in yachts, and some of us are, paddling along with one oar trying to make this work. So it's really important to keep that in mind when we're thinking about ourselves and our communities and our clients potentially. The headlines are not painting the best picture of the state of mental health in Canada right now and around the world, really, particularly for parents. So there have been plenty of headlines showing us that, parents in particular are struggling. Research coming out at this point that parents in particular are struggling with grief, with guilt, with stress, with mental health problems. So parents and women among the Canadians struggling the most, according to research, that there's this heavy mental health toll. And in fact, if anything, it seems to be getting worse. So some research coming out showing that, parents were doing worse at the 6-month mark than they were at the beginning. And so this stuff is really weighing on people, and there's a lot of exhaustion and fatigue happening at this point. And this is something that's showing up in our research. So Amanda and I both, in March of 2020, launched longitudinal studies looking at families' adjustment during this period. I mean, us and everyone else, right? Like, there's so many ongoing studies right now, but we were some of the first people to get them out. And we were pretty excited, thinking we were onto something, but it seems like lots of people have had this idea of looking at how parents and families are coping right now. So we launched a study looking at families in the US and Canada, almost 2,000 families. We have data now from baseline, which was in March of 2020, week 1, week 2, and then the 6-month follow-up that we just recently completed. So we're really excited to look at that in more depth. But you can see some quotes here from kids, and I definitely share their sentiments. I hate coronavirus. I wish it would go away. It's not fair. And such. So these are responses from early on in the pandemic from kids. So our kids are definitely feeling the stress and fatigue from all of this as well. I'll pass it on to Amanda.
Yeah, thanks. So, I did a similar study as to what Lindsay mentioned, and part of the reason as a trauma researcher that I was really interested in studying this is, thinking about what this is going to mean for like child maltreatment rates, and, just how a crisis of this scale is going to impact children and families. And the interesting thing, I think, why a lot of researchers, as Lindsay mentioned, just sort of jumped at the opportunity to study this is because we sort of knew it was coming. Like, how many crises could we say, things like 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, school shootings, all of these national and sometimes, global events that we study, usually we're only able to look at the aftermath. But because with COVID-19, we sort of had this sense it was coming. I don't know that any of us knew how bad it was actually going to get in our respective countries. But so we were able to collect baseline data, as Lindsay noted, like collect information to see how are people doing before this really starts full throttle, and then how that's going to look over time. So I did this primarily in the US was my sample. So about 450 or so families. You can just see a little bit of information about who made up our sample. And, again, it was just this unique opportunity to track a crisis in real time. And so I'll just give you a quick snapshot of some of the things that we found. Lindsay, you can go to the next one. Thanks. So parents, provided demographic information for us and completed assessments on stress. We looked at general stress, parenting stress, and child adjustment. And so I know this is hard to read. I'll just sort of give you the quick highlights. And we're also in the throngs of kind of analyzing the final round of data. So we studied parents again, at baseline before it began, at 1 week, at 1 month, and then at 3 months time period. And we basically have found that parents of younger children, so in grades, sort of kindergarten through 5th grade, reported higher parenting stress over time. So that's not really surprising, right? Just based on a lot of the anecdotes and lived experiences many of you all have probably heard in your own lives or with your clients, that the younger the children are, the harder it has been to sort of manage them full time at home with their respective remote learning requirements and our own job obligations. So parents of younger kids had higher parenting stress, but their general stress didn't seem that different from parents of older kids. About 1 in 4 kids, so just under 25% of children, were rated by their parents as showing clinical levels of psychosocial difficulties between March and June. So even in just that 3 or so month period, we saw pretty significant impacts in terms of children's emotional and behavioral health struggling, being negatively impacted. Okay, so just one more difference we found there that may be of interest as you're working with families. Younger kids tended to be at higher risk for externalizing problems at clinical levels. So things like aggression, anger, tantruming, really these externalizing emotional and behavioral expressions. Whereas older kids were at higher risk for clinical levels of internalizing problems. So depressive symptoms, isolating, being withdrawn. So pretty interesting, I think, differences there in how kids of different ages are being impacted by things like the isolation and removal from school and such. So at the end of the day, what we're finding, and I think a lot of other studies are finding also, is the cyclical relationship between parent stress and kid stress, right? So stress is being transmitted back and forth. As parents' stress goes up, same with kids, and vice versa. But the nature of that transmitting of stress may depend a lot on the child's developmental level. So this is why we started Pandemic Parenting. Lindsay and I had been doing these studies, but realizing as we both were getting into the throngs of analyzing the data this summer, many of you all know it takes a really long time for studies like this to get published. And so we were sitting on information that could be really helpful to people right now, especially as we were entering the fall and what was going to be looking like a whole nother round of this. So we sort of, put our heads together and said, like, there's got to be a better way for us to get this information out to parents and families and those who work with children now, in ways that can be helpful to them immediately. And we also know that often in our field and in a lot of the other sciences, we don't tend to do a great job of translating the information in ways that are accessible to people, and engaging and interesting and understandable. So we created Pandemic Parenting just as this, free web platform. We do webinars every other week. It was coming from our desire to give psychology away and just find interesting ways to get information into the hands of families who can use this information the most. So you see here some examples of some of the recent webinars we've done. We're trying to tackle really timely topics, things that parents, and again, those who work with families, are telling us they really have questions about, they're struggling with, they want to know more about. We bring in experts for each webinar. We had some really amazing guests. So we did one on building resilience a couple months ago with Dr. Bruce Perry. We'll give some examples from that in just a bit. We did one not too long ago on anti-racist pandemic parenting. As Lindsay mentioned, the one we just did about a week ago was on single parenting and co-parenting in the pandemic. After all of these webinars, we post all the recordings along with lots of other resources and facilitator questions. And the reason we wanted to mention that to you all is because you work in these different capacities with families, that it may be helpful to, take some of the recordings or snippets or resources, share them with your clients, with the families you work with. Use these facilitator questions, maybe in group conversations or parent community conversations, to just say, hey, how is this impacting you? Is this something you've faced? And it just really starts, these conversations start to build this community of support and authenticity that, we're all struggling in different ways and nobody has this figured out perfectly. So we encourage you to go to the website. We'll be posting all of that stuff, and you'll have it at the end of the slides as well, where you'll find all of these free recordings and resources and facilitator questions. So that's one of the primary things we do. We also, if you want to go to the next one, we realize most people don't have time to sit through a 1 hour webinar, except for all of you wonderful people who are taking the 1 hour today to do that. So But for parents, and again, those of us trying to manage a lot, it's hard to carve out that time. So we also take these 1 to 2 minute snippets and create these sort of snack break videos that are really the highlights, quick tips and tools from our various experts that have joined us. So you'll find those on our YouTube channel and on the website. We also have partnered with Zulily to produce a number of these blogs, again, that are translating a lot of the psychological science in really sort of conversational and honest ways. We'll again share some tidbits from a few of those in just a bit, but you can find all of those blog posts on the website as well. And then these are just all of our social media channels where, again, all of the resources are free. We really ask and encourage you to share them with others. The goal is to be helping people, supporting them right now, giving information to them that might be useful, and particularly the most vulnerable families are who we know could benefit the most from these kinds of things. So I'll turn it back to you, Lindsay. You're muted.
Well, this is the first time I've used this, so, it makes sense that I would not figure that out. So sorry. So today we wanted to talk to you about some of the highlights, I suppose, of things. So now that we've kind of covered, well, why are we doing this? Like, why are we talking about parenting? I mean, I'm not a parenting researcher per se. Like, I study children's memories and how they cope with difficult experiences. I wouldn't have thought a year ago that I was talking about parenting. So we want to point out that we're not doing this because we think we're perfect parents or that we have all the answers. And also that, we're not giving, individual clinical advice today, but we wanted to talk about a few key things that we've been seeing. So one is that, people are experiencing a lot of loss right now, big things and small things. We wanted to talk about grief and how it looks different from depression and how to hopefully prevent it from turning into depression. Talking about guilt and how, we can sort of cope with that and hopefully minimize that feeling, and talk a little bit about good enough parenting. And then giving yourself grace is how we can hopefully end on a hopeful note, talking about grace and how you might think about giving yourself some of it during this difficult time, or maybe recommending these strategies with the clients that you work with. So we'll talk about self-care, and what a through hike is. So starting off with grief, Amanda.
Yeah, so grief, just to sort of distinguish, because we're seeing a lot of these terms thrown around, and these are the kinds of things we try to do a lot with the pandemic parenting resources, is just demystify and break down some of these concepts that many of you who are mental health professionals, we often take for granted that people just know that there are these differences or how these things might impact lives. So grief's basically our natural reaction to a loss. It's not limited just to the loss of people. That's an important distinction. Often people assume that means somebody must have died if you're feeling grief. It's important to note that the grief process looks different for each of us, and all of us experience grief at some point in our lives, but some experience that grief more intense than others. So the typical types of things, we grieve, of course, are death of a loved one, as I mentioned, relationships, income or job loss, pets, our health, lost opportunities, things like that. So lots of different things we might be grieving. But right now in a pandemic, there's a lot more that we're grieving, and it might look a little different. So in a recent podcast, David Kessler was talking with Brene Brown. He's a world-renowned grief expert, and he noted in this podcast, which I thought was really striking. He said, we don't even have enough time to count the losses we're all encountering right now. And so if you think back to March, when this really sort of kicked off, what are all of those things, big and small, that we each have lost? And how has that taken shape, and how have we responded or just sort of honored and acknowledged that over the last 8 to 9 months or so? So I want to just talk about different types of grief for a few minutes, because I think that's also important to distinguish. And again, especially in your respective clinical settings and workplaces. So normal grief is gradually accepting the loss, whatever that might be, while still being able to manage basic daily activities. That's different than, what we call traumatic grief, which is more abrupt or unexpected, often in a tragic way, and there's pretty substantial distress that results. Complicated grief, sometimes also called complex bereavement. The feelings of loss there are debilitating, and they don't tend to improve over time. The pain tends to be long-lasting, pretty severe. and the person is often unable to recover or resume aspects of their own life. Collective grief is grief felt by a collective group, so a community, a society, a nation. Essentially, what we're experiencing in some ways right now in this pandemic. What does that collective grief look like in our different communities, countries, again, globally? So one other piece to mention here, though, is that grief and growth can go hand in hand. So as I noted, grief's an inevitable part of all of our lives. It's something we all encounter and something we're going to repeatedly encounter, again, at different levels of intensity or severity. So given that, grief is not the problem. We shouldn't be afraid of our children or even us experiencing grief. It's the traumatic or complicated grief that can cause longer term problems. And so I think that's an important distinction to make. So we have to be allowed to feel the pain of our loss in order to grow from it and acknowledge that it's okay to not be okay. And this is a great infographic Lindsay and I stumbled upon not too long ago. It's from just an awesome Instagram account. If you're on Instagram, you can see her handle there, Happy as a Mother. So she is a mental health clinician and, also is just doing this great job visually of breaking down a lot of these different things. And so this is one she posted fairly early in the pandemic, just trying to help people understand, it's okay to grieve. It's okay to grieve things like your canceled trips, that prom didn't end up happening, your graduation ceremony. If you were pregnant and having a baby, your birth plan couldn't go the way you always imagined or hoped it would. And so a lot of these things that people, certainly in our work with pandemic parenting, that people have said, oh, I feel silly feeling bad about these things, when others have it so much worse, or I feel silly grieving, my child's birthday party when, no one in my family has gotten COVID and we're all healthy. And so this is just a really important reminder, I think, for all of us that it is okay to grieve these things, that you don't need to be comparing your loss or your grief necessarily to others. Perspective is helpful. It's important for us. It's important for our kids to give that perspective. Of course, things can always be worse, but both of those things are important and possible to hold together. It can be worse. We're so grateful that we're healthy. And I'm really sad that we don't get to have, this experience that we hoped we had. So just, remembering that it is okay to grieve what may feel like small things, but that's actually an important part of our grief process.
Definitely. Yeah, it's okay for us to do it and to model that for our kids, and it's okay for our kids to do it and for us to try to not, brush it to the side, right? Say like, yeah, I understand that you're sad about that. I'm sad about the graduation or whatever it is too. So we're seeing it too in what our kids are feeling and reporting in our studies. These are a few quotes from kids and parents in our study on Canadian and US families, what they're thinking about, what they're talking about having lost, hating how things have changed. They miss their activities, they miss the playground. They miss birthday parties, friends, worried that things are not going to ever return to normal. And these are, 6-year-old, 5-year-old, 10-year-old. So we were seeing that in some patterns that the younger kids especially are more concerned about like, well, how is this going to impact me right now? Like I've got this, very egocentric view of my world. And so that's all I can see, which makes sense developmentally. So Amanda has very nicely distinguished between grief or the different types of grief, and then to talk a little bit about how grief, how we can prevent it from becoming depression or from turning into depression. So working on building and sustaining routines for ourselves and for our kids. So we know that having predictability in our kids' lives, having a routine and structure is really important. And so that is one way that we can help protect them from some of the stress and uncertainty that we're all experiencing right now. Building and sustaining connections, even those that may be online right now, and how those can kind of get us through this time. Physical activity is a big one. I hate to admit that, but there's plenty of research out there showing that. And there's some even that when we did our webinar on pregnancy and postpartum in the COVID-19 pandemic, there's already studies coming out showing that getting some daily physical activity helps prevent postpartum depression in moms who are giving birth during this difficult time. Creating outlets for regulation, things that allow us to relax. They don't have to necessarily be very time consuming, but they're crucially important. Balancing our activities, I think that's especially difficult right now in balancing work life and home life, because it seems like there is no real separation between those things anymore, at least for some of us who are still working from home. And then identifying and working towards certain goals. And those can be small things, but just having something on the horizon to look forward to or to be working towards. These are ways that we can help prevent grief from becoming more clinical depression. Some things to think about or reflect on yourself, or to maybe ask your clients these questions. What kinds of losses they've experienced, or you've experienced, or your children have. What are you grieving, the big things and the small things? And then how has COVID-19 affected how your family grieves losses? So obviously many people have lost family members during this time, or other loved ones. And, the grief process and the, and funerals and all of the kind of rituals that we have been disrupted, and what that means for our grieving process. And then what are some things you can do to fill your own cup so you can protect your mental health and be able to show up for others too? So the end of this webinar, we have several tips that we hope will be helpful in that regard. I'll turn it back to Amanda to move into the other one of our 3 G's today, guilt.
Yes, onto the guilt section of our 3 G's. So you've been hearing a lot about probably mom guilt these days. Maybe you felt it yourself. And so we did, in fact, a whole webinar on that topic with psychologist and author of a book called The Not Good Enough Mother, Dr. Sharon Lamb. And we can post the link for that in the chat as well. And, part of it is because we were just hearing from so many moms about, like, mom guilt already is hard, but man, in this pandemic, has it gotten that much harder, just in terms of being able to do all the things tenfold, because all of the things now, we were being asked to do so much more. So just a couple of things to think about here related to, again, distinguishing some of these concepts between guilt versus shame. So we know that infants tend to show us emotions from very early on, things like distress, anger, fear, and happiness. Sometime between the ages of 18 and 24 months, they start to experience and show new emotions like guilt, shame, and pride, which are more complicated emotions. They're called self-conscious emotions. And those emotions depend on the toddler's ability to actually think about themselves in relation to other people. So guilt and shame are a result of again, thinking about yourself, but within the context or in comparison to others. So it's important to keep in the back of our minds that guilt is this self-conscious emotion. To experience it, we must be reflecting on some standard that we're holding for ourselves, or we think others are holding for us, and then we're experiencing regret or maybe remorse that we're not meeting that standard. So the difference between guilt and shame, guilt is feeling bad after making a mistake or a poor choice. And the good thing about guilt in some ways is that it can motivate us to work toward change. Shame, on the other hand, causes us to label ourselves as bad or a failure and can actually prevent us from making positive change. So you can see in the examples here, with guilt, we might say something like, I screwed up, I am a terrible mother. With shame, we might say something like, I screwed up, I'm a terrible mother. But with guilt, we would say, I screwed up, and how can I do it better next time? There's a difference there in the sort of labeling of yourself and putting it all under this umbrella of, I must be a terrible mother, as distinct from, I can try again, I can do this better next time. So what's really interesting about the concept of, mom guilt is it isn't actually guilt. It's often shame. So, as we've talked about with children developing the capacity for guilt, the capacity for guilt is an important part of our growth as a parent. It helps us step back, reevaluate and improve our parenting. But when we feel shame, we can get stuck in this cycle of comparing ourselves to others and hindering our ability to adapt or improve. And, a lot of what has honestly helped me get through the pandemic on those days that have not been my award-winning mommy days is knowing, like, today was rough and I screwed up a lot of things, but you know what? I get to try again tomorrow. I get a do-over. Every day I get a do-over. And it is that sort of guilt framework of, I'm going to try to do better next time, which is very different than, I am an awful mother and, like, I give up. I can't do this, right? Or I'm never going to be able to do this the right way. So I just want to share a couple tips for letting go of that guilt and shame. So these were adapted from an article on letting go of mom guilt. As research indicates that this experience tends to be more prevalent among moms. So I know we keep calling it mom guilt, and it's mostly because that's where the research really has focused on the degree to which mothers tend to experience this phenomenon so much more than fathers do. But not to say that fathers can't feel some of these similar guilt or shame feelings. So these strategies will, of course, work for all parents. So it's important to recognize that is what I'm experiencing guilt, or is it shame, and how can I use it to work towards growth and progress rather than having it stunt my ability to move forward. You've probably heard this expression a lot, putting your own mask on first, which we think is just really important, that we can't be of help to our kids, to others. For those of you working in, various mental health and care support roles, I can't help my clients if I myself am struggling a lot. And so, putting on your own oxygen mask first. Finding ways to share your responsibilities, trying to not take it all on yourself, recognizing where there are things that, maybe my partner or a friend or family member or somebody else, maybe it's in the work context. Can we delegate this a little bit differently, because I feel like I am taking on more than my fair share right now, and I just can't manage everything, all the balls I'm trying to keep in the air at once. Surrounding yourself with supportive people, even if virtually. There are some, ways that we can get support. For me, sometimes it's been helpful to talk to other mom friends at night, do a bit of a post-game analysis, like, man, here are all the ways, today did not go well. And just as my dear friend and colleague likes to say, to borrow somebody else's prefrontal cortex for a bit, right? If I am just overwhelmed and exhausted and I can't think creatively about how to do this differently, or why my, one son may be struggling with remote learning in this way, but my other isn't, borrow somebody else's prefrontal cortex and have those supportive people in your life that can help you think it through a bit more clearly. Fight back against these irrational thoughts like, I am a terrible parent, or I am not good at my job, I can't do this. Trying to talk yourself down from that can be really helpful. Give yourself permission slips to screw up. Of course, we're going to have days, there's no such thing as a perfect parent, which Lindsay's going to talk a little bit more about in a bit. So give yourself those permission slips to have days where you screw it up. In the scheme of it, in the scheme of things, the kids will be okay if we have 1 or 2 days where we aren't, and for me, a heck of a lot more than 1 or 2 days, I will tell you, throughout this pandemic of not being at our best. Stop comparing yourself to others. I already talked about that a bit as it relates to the shame piece of this. Social media does not tell the whole picture, as I hope everybody, is well aware and is reminding themselves often. Just because we're seeing pictures of how other people's are doing it does not mean that that is reality. And so how you need to parent, what's right for you and your family right now, is very different than somebody else. And so all you can really do is make the best decisions for yourself and your family, or those you are supporting, one day at a time. And prioritize connection. As Lindsay mentioned, that's just been a really critical piece we've seen all throughout the research, in finding ways to stay connected to our villages, to help our clients, stay connected to their support people, is really going to be critical for our ability to keep moving through this. Okay. Turn it back to you, Lindsay.
Right, thank you. And we would add probably one more to that list.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
So, that's okay. That leads very nicely into my next little section. So to practice good enough pandemic parenting. So what is good enough parenting? So I first came across this term in grad school, actually, maybe 15 years ago, and in some of the writings of Sandra Scar, a psychology professor who specialized in child development. And she was famous for saying, and I have this quote here, good enough ordinary parents probably have the same effect on their children's development as culturally defined super parents. So when I came across this term as a grad student, I was far, many, many years from becoming a parent at that time myself, but I still was kind of turned off by this term, like good enough parenting. I mean, especially for those of us who are, always striving to be the best at what we do and to do, a really good job at whatever that is, just good enough, it just rubbed me the wrong way. And I think Amanda had a similar reaction when she first came across it. It was pretty controversial what she wrote then. But essentially her main point was that you can do a lot of harm by being very bad at this job of parenting. But you can't do that much good being incredibly good at it. So again, her point was really that, you don't maybe need to be the super parent who is signing your kids up for everything and baking cupcakes from scratch and doing all of these things that we sort of tell ourselves that we are quote unquote supposed to be doing, or that we're getting these messages that we're supposed to be doing these things. And this is how we build, happy, successful kids. And so just to kind of think about it as, well, what's a good enough parent? So an ordinary parent who loves and supports and nurtures their kids, and that is the most important thing. And so that was really her main message, that, as Amanda said, there's no such thing as a perfect parent. We have to think about what am I like right now? What are the circumstances I find myself in, and what is my child like right now, or my children, and how do they differ? So this concept of goodness of fit comes in. Like, I need to be the right parent to this particular child at this moment in history, at this time, and to focus on that. So, that could look very different during the pandemic versus in regular times or more normal times, but really focusing on what our children need right now. And to remember that, we're probably not gonna, I'm not trying to give people a license to maybe just, half-ass it or anything. But, maybe you don't need to worry that you're ruining your child because they, didn't, you raised your voice once, or you don't have to spend time in front of the computer. Was this great viral post from Bunmi Ladidan, I think, about how she just burst into tears trying to buy vitamins for her kids because, 45 minutes of research to try to figure out what vitamins to buy. It's just too much. And so to think about, what do the children really need right now, and to hopefully show up as that good enough parent. So to think, again, reflect for yourself or for your clients, to ask them, what sorts of things have you been feeling guilty about during this pandemic? Are they different from things you would normally feel guilty about? What does good enough parenting look like for you in the pandemic and for your kids? What are some ways that you can shift the expectations that you hold for yourself and your family during the COVID-19 pandemic? And that's a really big one that I want to talk about in terms of shifting to thinking about solutions, or at least some tips that you can hopefully take with you today that we hope will be useful. And this is the grace section. So how do you give yourself grace during this time? And I should, looking at the time, I should definitely speed it up here. So I, get sort of annoyed with all of the people telling me that I should be engaging in more self-care, and that's what's going to solve my problems. Because I realized I had quite a narrow definition of what self-care means, right? That it's yoga and bubble baths and, things like that. And that's just not something that I feel like I have time for most days as a busy parent, but certainly now. So started reconceptualizing what self-care can be. And for me, came up with a couple of tips. So self-care can be saying no, right? Are there things right now that you can say no to at work or at home with your kids? Research shows that women are especially likely to volunteer for tasks at work or to be assigned tasks at work that are really the kind of thankless type of tasks that are not going to lead to promotion and not really help your career. So are there things you can say no to or not volunteer for right now? Ask for what you need. Are there things you can ask for? If you have a partner, are there things you can ask for there in terms of, co-managing the mental load of what needs to be done? So not just doing the things or help doing the things, but in remembering and managing what those things are, because a lot of this kind of mental load or emotional labor often falls to moms. And so thinking about that and how you might be able to delegate or co-manage some of that stuff. And then lowering, or somebody pointed out to me, managing maybe might be a better word, your expectations during this time. So are you still holding on to pre-pandemic expectations for yourself as a mom, as a dad, as an employee, as a wife? You might need to let some of those things go and to think about, what are truly the most important things? What are the big priorities right now? and how can you lower or manage your expectations to focus on those? So Amanda.
Yeah, and I just posted, Lindsay actually wrote a great blog outlining a lot of those things she talked about. So I just posted that in the chat. So this sort of last bit of advice around grace we just want to give, and then we'll wrap it up and tie in some final thoughts, comes from the conversation we had with Dr. Bruce Perry a couple months ago when we were talking with him about building resilience, both for ourselves and for our kids. And so, Lindsay and I both talked about how, I mean, this is not even a sprint, like it feels like a marathon and, not knowing when this is going to end. And, he corrected both of us and said, it's not even a marathon, it's a through hike. And, we both said, I'm sorry, a what? And he said, well, yeah, this is when people hike from Mexico all the way up to Canada. And I think we both were stunned that this is a thing that people do, by choice. And so we did a little bit of research on what through hikes are. And we actually found many helpful tips that really experienced through hikers know, and they have this sort of lingo and this shared expertise that we can actually apply in many ways to the pandemic. And so, we'll post this blog that was just published not too long ago in the chat as well. But I just want to give you a few highlights from that. So, what through hikers know is that you should just hike your own hike. And this goes back to that idea of not comparing what we're doing to others, and recognizing that we have had to make different decisions for our families in our lives than somebody else will need to. And so focusing and hiking on your own hike. Picking a shorter trail, which relates to the idea, that Lindsay was just talking about, that sometimes we have to change our expectations. Life throws us these curveballs. And so we have to adjust what our path might look like, even if just for a short period of time. It doesn't have to be forever. But, thinking about this idea that what we're doing sort of works until it doesn't, and then we may need to adapt or pick a shorter trail. I really loved what we learned about this notion of cameling up, right? So through hikers talk about camel up, which just means, they take in as much water as they can at various points along their journey to sustain them until they can reach their next water source. And so for us, in pandemic parenting and thinking again about the families that you support, what does it look like to camel up for us? For me right now, it's when my kids are constantly fighting, or I feel really overwhelmed at not being able to get my work done. But then I have these moments where I look up and see, my oldest son very sweetly reading a book to my youngest son, just in a corner quietly. Like, you have these moments that sustain you through the hours that can be really exhausting or grueling in different ways. So those mental images are how I sometimes camel up. And then a couple other ideas here, just taking 0 days, which is related to that notion of like giving yourself a permission slip to mess up, or to take a mental health day if you need to. And then trail magic, which is just these unexpected occurrences that lift our spirits or inspire gratitude, things that other people have done for us that we haven't even realized. This is one of the best buffers that we have in these prolonged stressful experiences, is accepting that support from others. And so looking for that trail magic. So at the end of the day, just a couple of highlights on what we want you to know, the gist of a lot of what we've learned now in the last 4 months of pandemic parenting, and some of the biggest takeaways essentially from our research. So I don't know, Lindsay, if you're able to advance to the next one.
It appears to be frozen for me.
Oh, all right. No worries.
Wait, nope, there we go.
There you go.
Okay.
Okay. So adjusting our expectations, I hope that's a big theme you've heard from us today, that we cannot continue to move through life in the way we were in February of 2020. And so as we've tried to sort of give you a few examples of what that looks like, meaning I can't expect myself to be the same parent I was in March. I can't expect my kids to be the same as they were, before March. And so who do I need to be? What are the reasonable expectations for myself, for my family, for my coworkers, for those I am supporting, right? Adjusting our expectations, both of ourselves and of our kids in these contexts. Acknowledge that this is not normal or sustainable. So if like Lindsay presented some of those headlines and some of the research around how this is actually harder or worse for people at that 6-month point, which has been surprising, I think, for a lot of people, because this is not sustainable. We're not wired to constantly operate under this prolonged sense of uncertainty and stress. And so, that is exhausting and not sustainable. So at the end of the day, what we've learned from months of having all these conversations with so many amazing experts is that kids need to feel safe and loved. That's what's most critical. And that they need predictability, routine, and these moderate doses of stress. So that is how we build resilience, and model resilience for our kids, is trying to introduce, where can we give them some modicum of control when so much is outside of their control? Where can we have some of that routine or predictability, even if it's just sort of on a day-to-day basis? And what we've learned that parents need are to feel seen and supported. And certainly what I think is going to come out of a lot of the research that's being done is this huge spotlight on these systemic barriers, right? On the disparities and gaps that we're seeing, of people of different socioeconomic statuses, of people of different races and ethnicities, just recognizing like these systemic barriers that have just made things worse for some families versus others. And so that's going to be a really important part of the work moving forward.
Definitely. So I just want to quickly let you know about our next Pandemic Parenting Exchange webinar, which is on Monday, December 7th at 8 o'clock Central, 9 o'clock Eastern. And you can register for free with the link there. And it's on the positives and negatives of screen time during a pandemic, or really just in general. And we have some fantastic experts from Canada and the US who are going to talk to us about screen time, which has been one of the things that parents have asked us about repeatedly. That is definitely at the top of their list of things that they want to hear about. So we hope that you can register for that and join us for that. I'm going to skip this for now so we can jump to the questions. But thank you so much for listening. And Mandy, do we have questions?
Hi, yes. Oh my goodness. Thank you both so much for sharing all of your information. This has been incredible. I absolutely love your website. I love what you do with pandemic parenting. And I just encourage everybody to take a look. And I'm excited about the December 7th webinar. I'll definitely be tuning in. It's certainly something that we've heard from a lot of the parents and professionals that we're working with, that screen time is really a hot topic. I just wanted to share that, as far as what resonated with me is certainly that cyclical relationship between parent and child stress. So I'm thinking about, you'd mentioned how to fill your own cup. So I'm curious, Amanda and Lindsay, if you could share with us a little bit about what the two of you do to fill up your own cup during these difficult times.
Yeah, good question. Not
That
enough,
is a great
I would
question.
say. Yeah, not enough. I think for me, I've never been a runner until recently, and boy, did I step up my running through the summer when the weather was nice. In part because it was just a break. It was like I'm an extrovert through and through, but man, did I need alone time, because I was, I have 3 young boys, 10, 8, and 4, and my husband's working from home, and so I never had an opportunity to be alone, which I didn't realize how much I would crave, and so. So finding a way to just get out of the house and run for like a half hour a day was a godsend for me. And it just let me clear my head and have nobody need me for 30 minutes.
Yeah, beautiful. I can't run. I never have been able to, but I definitely can now. But I go on walks, so that has helped. And I never really had time for that before, but because of the, working from home and everything, and the lack of commute. So for me, it's been going on walks with books on Audible. And I've listened to so many books on Audible this year, and that has been a huge kind of outlet and release for me. The other thing is, with the Canadian border closed and all of my family being on the other side of the border, I did have a trip because my brother got married, and then I had to quarantine by myself for 2 weeks. And that was an amazing, people were like, oh, that's so hard. It must be so hard to quarantine for 14 days. And this was after 6 months straight of constant parenting, what I called relentless parenting. So that helped me kind of bounce back quite a lot, although I'm not necessarily recommending 2 weeks of isolation, but you take what you can get, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you both. I'm looking, we've got quite a few questions. We've only got about 5 minutes left. So I thought I would ask, we've got a couple of questions related to children with special needs and with disabilities. So any particular insights into how to support children who might be living with some special needs during the pandemic?
That is an excellent question. And it's something we have our eye on to be doing a webinar in early 2021, because we just have had so many requests. We recognize that the challenges are different. That's certainly come through, I think, both in Lindsay's research and in mine, is just, this looks very different, when you are trying to manage all of this with a child with special needs. It's been looked different for the teacher. My brother is a special education teacher. And so as he's just sort of talked about trying to pivot and adapt, you just can't in some of the same ways that other schools and teachers have been able to. So we hope to have more specific resources and information about that, as I said, pretty early in 2021, because we know that that is a special population of parents we need to be supporting in different ways. And so I don't know that we have great answers yet, other than to just sort of honor and recognize, like, that through hike looks quite a lot different than it does for other parents.
And I think to acknowledge too that that's some of the things that we're seeing come out in the early analyses of our data, is that parents of kids with special needs do seem to be experiencing, more stress during this time than other parents, which makes sense. And I think is, what we would generally find, but it seems really exacerbated by the pandemic and by their lack of the services that they would typically have, right? And those outlets, for sure.
Yeah. Right. Mandy, can I answer? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
All I was going to say, I see Danny's question in there, and it's such a great one, just recognizing this group. So Danny asked, if we wanted to make a presentation for parents in our communities, what are the biggest key points to focus on? And so I would, and we will send you the slides. I saw that question too. Sorry, we forgot to send them to Mandy ahead of time. So we will be happy to send those for you to distribute, but take a look at the gist slide, some of those main points for what people need. But the other thing I would say is use these resources, like go to pandemic-parent.org. This is why we create them, because we know that, we can't be everywhere, and we're not the experts in your populations and your groups. And so take the recordings, watch them with, families you support, or some of those little quick 2-minute videos, and just say, hey, does this resonate with you? That's why we always post the reflection questions as an opportunity. So like the tools are there. You don't have to do any of the work to facilitate these conversations in your networks and with your spheres, because that's what we hope actually is much more than people want to listen to us, is that they want to listen to you. They have the relationship with you. So take these resources, go and use them in whatever ways are helpful, so that you can have these conversations with the families you're supporting.
And I think that's a great way to use those snack break videos too, because it might be that you want to pull, instead of an entire hour-long webinar on something, you could pull a 2-minute clip from the mom guilt one, and a 2-minute clip from building resilience. And, that a lot of them really have some overlap and go together really well. So, and it wouldn't be as long and as much of a commitment, which is tough. I see a question too from Alexandria relating to single parents who are struggling to balance work and parenting. Yeah, we certainly want to, again, honor and acknowledge single parents who have been on my mind a lot during this entire time when I've been struggling so much, but I have, a very actively involved co-parent and spouse who lives with me and the kids. And so it's just there's so many challenges. And we just did our webinar on this. We don't have the recording posted yet, but we think we will in the next couple of days or so. And so I would invite you to go and check that out, because we had 2 clinical psychologists who work specifically with parents in this situation, and they had so many great tips that actually, helped me a lot as well. So
yeah. And if you sign up for the email newsletter, you'll get notified as soon as that's up. It should be up in the next day or so. So yeah, that way you'll always know when these resources are there. But please use them in whatever way that's helpful. That's why they're there.
This has been so incredible. I recognize that we've just got about a minute left, and I wonder, Amanda and Lindsay, if you'd be open to me sending you the questions that we've got from people that we haven't been able to get to, and maybe just 30 seconds on recognizing we're heading into the holidays. Is there anything specific, any tips and tricks that you might share with parents as far as supporting kids at this time?
Go ahead, Lindsay.
Yes. Just wrote a blog on this actually, and we have a webinar on reimagining the holidays as well, because we know that this is a huge thing for parents right now. And just to think about, essentially preparing kids for that the holidays are going to look different, right? Talking to them in advance about what the plans are going to be this year and how they might look different. They probably won't be that surprised, even the young ones. Everything else has looked different this year, right? For the most part. So, but preparing them, research shows that, you know, giving them the expectations helps them cope with difficult or challenging circumstances. So I would say to work on that. Allow them to be disappointed, but don't necessarily expect them to be. I mean, they might be okay with things that we are not okay with. We might be really sad that they're visiting Santa through like a plexiglass barrier and, you know, wearing masks and stuff, but they're really, you know, they're not too bothered about it. They're just excited about the experience. So allow them to be disappointed, but don't be careful not to be like pushing that vibe on them. Like, isn't this terrible? And isn't the holidays, you know, they're going to be awful this year, right? So focus on what you can do as a family and not just what you're not going to be able to do this year.
Thank you. Yeah. And I'll just, in our last 10 seconds, give one plug for, you know, Giving Tuesday was yesterday. Lindsay and I donate all of our time to pandemic parenting, but we have this amazing team that is producing all of these resources, and our efforts to keep them free for everybody depends 100% on contributions and donations. So if you have a couple dollars to spare to put toward more resources that we can do in 2021, we'd be most grateful. We'd love to keep supporting families as long as we can sustain this work. And thank you for having us, Mandy.
Yeah, amazing. Well, Lindsay and Amanda, I look forward to continuing this partnership, because I think there's so much that we have in common as far as our organization. So I really appreciate you taking the time today, and I look forward to what we can do in the future. And I wish everybody the best. This is our last webinar for the year, and we're looking forward to a really great 2021 ahead.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mandy. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Holidays. Okay.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.